In 1896, a European superpower marched into Africa with modern rifles and artillery, expecting an easy victory. What they met instead was a storm of warriors who shattered every myth about African weakness. This is the story history tried to bury, the day Africa defeated Europe on the battlefield. History has a way of forgetting the victories that don't fit the narrative. We've been told the story of European conquest so many times that it became the only story. But what if there was a battle where everything changed? A moment when African warriors looked a European empire in the eye and said, "Not here, not today." If you're tired of history that ignores African victories, hit that subscribe button right now. This story will change everything you thought you knew about colonialism. Drop a comment telling me which untold African story we should cover next. Now, let's go back to 1896, to the mountains of East Africa, where the impossible became reality. The late 19th century was a dark time for the African continent. In Berlin, in 1884, European powers gathered around a table covered with maps of Africa. They drew lines with rulers and pencils, dividing an entire continent like it was a pie at a dinner party. Nations that had existed for centuries were erased. Kingdoms were split in half. Families were separated by borders drawn by men who had never set foot on African soil. This was the scramble for Africa, and it was brutal in its efficiency. The Europeans had convinced themselves of a comfortable lie. They believed Africans were primitive, incapable of modern warfare, stuck in a tribal past. They had Maxim guns that could fire 500 rounds per minute. They had artillery that could level fortifications. They had military academies and tactical manuals written by centuries of European warfare. Most importantly, they had absolute confidence that the color of their skin meant destiny was on their side. Country after country fell. The British marched through southern and eastern territories. The French swept across the west and north. The Germans claimed their peace. The Belgians committed unspeakable horrors in the Congo. It seemed like nothing could stop the tide. European newspapers celebrated each conquest with barely contained glee. Military officers returned home as heroes for defeating what they called savage kingdoms. The technology gap was real. European weapons were more advanced. But technology alone doesn't win wars. As one African empire was about to prove, courage, strategy, and the will to remain free can overcome any weapon. In the highlands of East Africa stood a kingdom that refused to bow. The Ethiopian Empire was ancient when Rome was still young. For over 2,000 years, this Christian kingdom had survived invasions, internal conflicts, and the rise and fall of neighboring powers. Its churches were carved from solid rock. Its emperors traced their lineage back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This was not some scattered tribal confederation. This was a centralized state with administration, taxation, trade networks, and a fierce pride in its independence. On the throne sat Emperor Menelik II, a ruler who understood that the world was changing and Ethiopia needed to change with it. He was a student of history and military strategy. He collected maps and studied foreign languages. He knew what was happening across Africa. He watched the Europeans swallow kingdom after kingdom, and he understood that Ethiopia would eventually be on the menu. But Menelik was not just a warrior. He was a chess player, and he was thinking 10 moves ahead. Beside him stood Empress Taytu Betul, a woman whose brilliance in diplomacy and warfare would prove crucial in the coming conflict. While European histories would later try to diminish her role, make no mistake, she was a force of nature. She advised the emperor on strategy, commanded her own army, and would personally lead troops into battle when the moment came. Together, they formed a partnership that would reshape history. Italy had been eyeing the region for years. As the newest European power, desperate to claim its place among colonial empires, Italy saw Ethiopia as its opportunity for glory. They had already established a foothold in Eritrea to the north. In 1889, they signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Emperor Menelik. This is where things get interesting. The treaty was written in two languages, Italian and Amharic. The Italian version stated that Ethiopia would conduct all foreign relations through Italy, essentially making it an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version said Ethiopia could seek Italian assistance if it chose to. One said must, the other said may. It was either a deliberate deception or a catastrophic translation error. Either way, it was about to start a war. When Menelik discovered the discrepancy, he was furious. Italy was claiming to the world that Ethiopia was under its protection, that they had the right to speak for this ancient empire. The emperor rejected this absolutely. He sent letters to European capitals declaring the treaty invalid. Italy refused to acknowledge his position. They had made their claim on paper, and they intended to back it up with steel. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history. But Menelik was already preparing. While Italian diplomats assured their government that Ethiopia was weak and divided, the emperor was doing something remarkable. He was buying weapons. Modern weapons. From Russia, from France, even ironically from Italy itself before relations collapsed. By 1895, Ethiopia had stockpiled over 100,000 rifles. They had artillery pieces. They had ammunition by the ton. European powers, playing their usual games of rivalry, were happy to sell weapons to anyone who might frustrate their competitors. Italy's enemies became Ethiopia's suppliers. The emperor didn't just buy weapons, he made sure his warriors knew how to use them. Ethiopian forces trained in modern military tactics while maintaining their traditional fighting spirit. They practiced formations, learned to coordinate infantry and cavalry, studied artillery placement. This wasn't going to be a chaotic charge against machine guns. This was going to be a sophisticated military operation planned by people who understood exactly what they were facing. Then Menelik did something that would prove decisive. He called for unity. Messages went out across the empire to every region, every ethnic group, every local leader. The call was simple and powerful. Foreign invaders were coming to take their land and their freedom. Old rivalries needed to be set aside. This was about survival, and the response was overwhelming. From the highlands and lowlands, from the north and south, warriors began to march. They brought their weapons, their determination, and their pride. Women came too, not just to support, but to fight. Empress Taytu herself would command thousands of female warriors. By early 1896, over 100,000 Ethiopian fighters had assembled. It was one of the largest military mobilizations in African history. Meanwhile, General Oreste Baratieri commanded the Italian forces in Eritrea. He had about 20,000 troops, a mix of Italian soldiers and colonial recruits from Eritrea and Somalia. On paper, his force looked formidable. They were professional soldiers with modern European training. They had confidence built on watching other European armies sweep through Africa. Baratieri reported to Rome that victory was certain. His officers talked about being in the Ethiopian capital within weeks. They planned their victory parade before the battle even started. But things started going wrong almost immediately. As Italian forces moved south, they found their supply lines under constant attack. Small Ethiopian units would strike and disappear into terrain they knew intimately. Food became scarce. Ammunition had to be rationed. Italian scouts brought back troubling reports. The Ethiopian force wasn't scattered bands of warriors. It was a massive, organized army moving with purpose. Baratieri began to worry. He sent messages to Rome requesting reinforcements. The Italian government, already under political pressure and questioning the expensive colonial adventure, told him to make do with what he had. The general faced a terrible choice. He could retreat, admitting that Ethiopia was too strong to conquer, and face humiliation at home. Or he could attack with the forces he had and hope European superiority would win the day. Pride made the decision. On the last day of February 1896, Baratieri ordered his forces to advance. They would march through the night and attack at dawn. The target was the town of Adwa, where Ethiopian forces were concentrated. It would be a quick strike to break Ethiopian morale. At least, that was the plan. March 1st, 1896. The sun rose over the mountains near Adwa, and with it came a reckoning. The Italian forces had marched through the night, but their maps were outdated and wrong. The three brigades that were supposed to advance together had become separated in the darkness and rough terrain. When dawn broke, they found themselves scattered across the mountainous landscape, unable to support each other, facing an enemy that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Ethiopian forces attacked with devastating coordination. From the high ground, they poured fire down on the confused Italian positions. The Italians had expected to face warriors with spears and outdated muskets. Instead, they were being hit by modern rifle fire from multiple directions. Ethiopian cavalry charged through gaps in the Italian lines. These weren't reckless attacks. They were calculated strikes at weak points, designed to create chaos and prevent the Italian brigades from linking up. General Baratieri tried desperately to coordinate his separated forces, but communication had broken down. Runners were being intercepted. The terrain made it impossible to see what was happening to the other brigades. Each Italian unit found itself fighting its own desperate battle, surrounded by thousands of Ethiopian warriors who knew every rock and ravine. The Italians had expected to use their superior discipline and firepower to mow down charging natives. Instead, they were being outmaneuvered and outfought. Then Empress Taytu's forces entered the battle. Thousands of warriors, including her personal army of women fighters, struck the Italian flank. The psychological impact was enormous. Italian soldiers, already shaken by the ferocity of the Ethiopian attack, now faced warriors who fought with a determination they had never encountered. These were people fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. Every inch of ground mattered to them in a way it never could to foreign invaders far from home. Ethiopian artillery, positioned on the heights, began shelling Italian positions. The explosions tore through ranks of men who had been told the enemy had no modern weapons. Italian colonial troops, recruited from Eritrea and Somalia, began to desert. They had no loyalty to a European power trying to conquer their neighbors. Some switched sides entirely, joining the Ethiopian forces. The Italian brigades, fighting separately, started to crumble. By midday, what had been a battle became a rout. Italian forces tried to retreat, but in the mountainous terrain, retreat meant chaos. Units dissolved. Officers lost control. Ethiopian forces pursued relentlessly. When the sun set on March 1st, the battlefield told a devastating story. Approximately 7,000 Italian soldiers lay dead. Another 11,000 were wounded or captured. The Ethiopian forces had suffered losses too. Around 7,000 warriors killed, but they held the field. They had won a complete and total victory. The news reached Rome and sent shockwaves through Europe. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Modern European armies didn't lose to African kingdoms. The Italian government tried to downplay the disaster, but the numbers couldn't be hidden. This was the worst defeat a European colonial power had suffered in Africa. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi was forced to resign. Anti-war protests erupted in Italian cities. The dream of an Italian empire in East Africa lay shattered in the mountains of Adwa. In October 1896, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. They recognized Ethiopian independence absolutely and completely. They paid reparations. They withdrew their claims. For the first time in the scramble for Africa, a European power had been forced to back down. Ethiopia would remain free. The victory at Adwa sent ripples across the African continent and beyond. In colonized territories, people whispered about the kingdom that had defeated a European army. It became a symbol that resistance was possible, that European conquest was not inevitable. When Pan-African movements emerged in the 20th century, they looked to Adwa as proof that Africans could stand against colonial powers. During the Civil Rights Movement in America, leaders pointed to Ethiopia's victory as evidence that the myth of white supremacy was exactly that, a myth with no basis in reality. But here's the tragedy. This incredible story, this moment when African warriors defeated a European empire in open battle, was largely erased from Western history books. For decades, it was a footnote if it appeared at all. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative that European conquest was inevitable and total. It suggested that other African kingdoms might have survived if circumstances had been different. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether technology alone explained European colonial success, or whether other factors like disease, geography, and internal African conflicts played larger roles. The Battle of Adwa teaches us lessons that echo far beyond 1896. It shows that unity in the face of oppression can overcome incredible odds. Emperor Menelik brought together diverse groups who might have fought each other under other circumstances, and that unity became their greatest weapon. It demonstrates that leadership matters profoundly. Menelik and Empress Taytu didn't just rally their people. They planned, they prepared, they understood their enemy, and they chose their ground carefully. The battle also reveals that technology isn't everything. Yes, the Ethiopians had acquired modern weapons, but so had the Italians. What made the difference was strategy, knowledge of terrain, motivation, and the willingness to fight for something that mattered more than life itself. The Italian soldiers were professionals fighting for national glory and colonial ambitions. The Ethiopian warriors were defending their homeland. That difference in motivation cannot be measured, but proved decisive. Ethiopia's victory had one more profound impact. When Benito Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia again in 1935, using tanks and poison gas, the memory of Adwa drove Ethiopian resistance. They fought for years against a much more powerful invasion, and though they were occupied, they never truly submitted. When liberation came in 1941, Ethiopia emerged as the symbol of African resistance to colonialism. Leaders of independence movements across Africa looked to Ethiopian history for inspiration. Today, the Battle of Adwa stands as a testament to what courage and determination can achieve. It reminds us that the colonial narrative of African weakness and European invincibility was propaganda, not truth. It shows us that history is full of stories that powerful people tried to bury because those stories threatened their worldview. And it proves that when we dig up these buried stories and bring them into the light, we discover that the world was always more complex, more inspiring, and more interesting than we were taught. The warriors who stood at Adwa weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people who did something extraordinary when the moment demanded it. They looked at an empire that had conquered half the world and decided that the line would be drawn here, on this mountain, on this day. This victory wasn't a miracle. It was strategy, unity, and the courage to fight for freedom. If this story moved you, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because we're uncovering more buried African histories that will blow your mind. In the comments, tell me what other African victories should the world know about. And remember, history is only forgotten when we stop telling it. Until next time, keep seeking the truth.